Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. Ann Jones about how war affects soldiers, families, and communities. Dr. Jones is currently an associate of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. She writes for The Nation and Tom Dispatch. She is also the author of They Were Soldiers, How the Wounded Return from America's Wars, The Untold Story, War is Not Over When It's Over, Women Speak Out from the Ruins of War, and Kabul in Winter, Life Without Peace in Afghanistan. You can follow her work at annjonesonline.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/veterans-issues. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. So I mentioned a lot of titles in the introduction, 3 books to be exact, and I'd like to get started just with a brief overview of what's in those books and what a reader can expect to find in there, and how those titles tie into the sorts of issues we'll be discussing over the course of this interview.
Well, to put them in the order in which they occurred, Kabul in Winter came out in 2006, and it's an overview of why Afghanistan is the way it is. Quite a lot of Afghanistan history and the history of conflicts there, and it focuses upon the problems of civilians after the fall of the Taliban. And then War is Not Over When It's Over is about civilian responses again to war, again focusing on women, but including a lot of men as well. And that book covers a whole range of wars I visited, or post-conflict zones in West Africa, the Congo, Burma, and then Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, where I interviewed the masses of people pouring out of Iraq during the surge. You know, the famous Petraeus surge that was supposed to be such a successful road to victory actually looked from the other side of the border very much like ethnic cleansing, and that's the way it looked to a lot of Iraqis, and tens of thousands of Iraqis fled the country at that time, and so their neighbors who were already pressed very hard by the number of refugees they'd taken in had to make room for many thousands more. And I talked to a lot of those people about the effects of the surge on civilian life in Iraq. So a whole range of America's wars and other wars as well.
All right, and you recently spoke at the Veterans for Peace conference. So before we dive into some of these issues, can you discuss what you talked about there, what sorts of things were covered at that conference?
I will. However, I just realized I neglected to mention my most recent book, which is They Were Soldiers, How the Wounded Come Home from America's Wars. And that is a book about the soldiers' side of war. I had to embed with American soldiers to do that, and then accompanied wounded soldiers through the whole process of trauma care from one hospital to another in Afghanistan, and then Germany, and then Washington, and finally to their homes, and wrote about what that experience is like, about the care that they get, the injuries they've received, and then write about their families and the adjustments that have to be made at home. So a lot of the consequences that most of the war journalists were not writing about, and that become kind of invisible to the American public, which has never seen anything like that, most of them. So that was the third book. It was, I think, because I wrote that book that I was asked to join the International Advisory Board for Veterans for Peace. And then this year they asked me to give a talk at their annual convention. And it's a really wonderful bunch of people, just great. The organization is still, I guess the majority of members of that organization are veterans of Vietnam, but I met veterans from as far back as World War II and from, of course, the more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere as well. So a full range of subjects under discussion about all the issues that concern them when they come back. Healthcare, of course, a big one, and reintegrating into their communities, issues of local politics and housing and jobs and all that kind of thing. And they address all sorts of issues themselves because their goal is to make justice for veterans and peace. And the theme of this year's convention was peace in the world and peace at home. And I can give you one example of some work they've been doing that's pretty impressive, I think, in making peace at home. During the Black Lives Matter campaign and demonstrations in Ferguson after the terrible events there, delegations of Veterans for Peace went and just asked Black Lives Matter what they could do to support them and demonstrate solidarity with them. And they were just present and marching with those demonstrators in a peaceful way to show that Black Lives Matter to these veterans who have fought for the country and whose chief interest is in making peace both in the world and here at home.
So you just said in that answer that some of the big issues that affect soldiers and their families aren't really talked about in the mainstream media. Can you give us a few more specifics on what some of those big issues are?
Well, one that I talked about at the conference is the efforts to demolish the VA. And this is a subject that's talked about in the VA or in the mainstream media occasionally, but it's talked about in ways that are very misleading. You probably know that there's a big movement afoot, sponsored by funders like the Koch brothers, to privatize veterans' health care. They want to get rid of that health care, but because they are ideologically opposed to anything that is socialized. And as you know, VA healthcare is an amazing system of lifelong socialized medicine for veterans that has been functioning for more than 60 years, fulfilling that responsibility that the country adopted way back in 1663, saying that we would take care of the government would take care of the veterans. The right wing doesn't like any kind of government responsibility, as you know, and so they have this big campaign going called Freedom for Vets, Freedom and Choice. And they have legislation before Congress now, introduced by John McCain, to give veterans vouchers, or they call them cards, choice cards, that would enable them to go to private doctors and not go to the VA. And they've done a pilot project on this under McCain introduced legislation that was passed a couple of years ago. And that has been a total fiasco. The poor veterans who've tried that, very few, incidentally, only a small percentage of eligible veterans elected to even try the choice cards. And of those who did, the overall effect was to just slow down the whole process of care. Many doctors are not participating. Those that are participating might not be in the specialties that the soldiers use. At the convention, when I spoke about this, I was overwhelmed afterwards by young vets who are seeking care at this time, talking to me about what a nightmare the choice cards are, and how they just want to get back into the VA if they possibly can. So if this is a crucial election for veterans, in that if a Republican Congress is again elected, this legislation will be passed, and it will do tremendous damage to what we've known all these years as VA healthcare. Instead of fixing the VA healthcare by funding it adequately, the Republicans, who have been voting repeatedly for a long time against funding the VA, now they want to wipe it out altogether. And if they get their way, that could very well happen. And it would be disastrous for the vets who, particularly those who have critical injuries or illnesses and need long-term care and rehabilitation. And the other thing I think that ought to concern all veterans, and that has not been written about at all, is that even if this choice card system works and every veteran could go to his own doctor in his own hometown, there would be no way of tracking in the long term those terrible residual effects of war that show up after one war after another. We would not know about things like Agent Orange because there would be no central record-keeping system that would track this and make it possible for veterans who suffer from something like Agent Orange or Gulf War syndrome or the respiratory problems that have shown up in Afghanistan and Iraq. There would be no way for them to bring their cause before the government and get restitution and ongoing and appropriate health care for those terrible long-term illnesses that they suffer. So that's huge. It means that no soldiers would ever find out about those the long-term aftermath that soldiers always suffer in these modern wars.
So I want to return to issues facing veterans upon returning home in a moment or two. But in order to have the proper context for this, let's talk about the journey from being wounded in combat to returning home. And I guess you discussed this in They Were Soldiers. But what can you, without getting too graphic, what can you tell us about that journey, about that process, and what it looks like?
Well, I can tell you that it is absolutely superb health care. The doctors are totally amazing, dedicated, absolutely dedicated, and overworked and still carrying on. It's an amazing system. The result of which is that tens of thousands of lives are saved that would have been lost in any previous wars. So that's the plus side. But the downside of that is that many of those vets whose lives are saved, have incurred terrible injuries that, of course, have done great damage to the quality of life that they will know from there on out. All the more reason we need the VA. But how the process works is, of course, the usual great medics and dust-up pilots in helicopters that evacuate wounded soldiers from wherever the incident has occurred, and get them into the nearest field hospital, or field station rather, which is normally a tent with a couple of surgeons in it and some nurses, and that just do very basic stabilization, just so the patients, the soldiers, can be safely flown on to the next stop, which in Afghanistan was usually Bagram Air Base or sometimes Kandahar. And there, the surgeons get right to work. They come off those dust-off choppers and right into the emergency room, and within a matter of minutes, the worst injured are in surgery. And they will remain at that hospital for as long as it takes to stabilize them and get them ready for the next longer flight to Landstuhl at Ramstein Base or near Ramstein Base in Germany. So they may be there 24 hours, 48 hours, and in that time they may have 7 or 8 visits to the operating room to continue the process. Then at Landstuhl, that same process continues, but we're moving up the level of trauma hospitals now, so that each hospital up the chain is equipped technically to do more than the previous one. So the efforts are to get them on as fast as possible then through the next steps at Landstuhl. Again, it could be just a day or sometimes a little longer, more surgeries there, and then on a medevac cargo flight again to Dover Air Base, and from there by ambulance immediately to Walter Reed. When I was following this, Walter Reed was still in the old one in Washington. Now, of course, it's merged with Bethesda. And that, of course, is the top level of trauma care, probably anywhere in the world. And then the surgeries will continue until the soldier is in a position to begin real rehabilitation, which may mean, learning to use prosthetic devices or adjusting in one way or another to whatever physical disabilities are going to remain with him or her for the rest of their lives.
So what is the process when service members return home for reintegrating themselves into their communities?
Well, this varies, of course, depending upon where home is for the service members. And some of them, are so seriously injured that they might remain at Walter Reed or Bethesda or at Brooke Army Medical Center for a year or two, sometimes even longer. And in those cases, it's usual for a family member, usually mom, to come to that hospital and become one of their caregivers at the hospital because they're there for a long stretch of time. Then when they're ready to go home, again, they may have to be hospitalized in a vet medical center near their home, as many are, for another period of time. and then, or they may be able to go to their own homes. But there again, if they're still requiring assistance in their daily lives, that may fall to the wife or to mom and dad. And but some, of course, make what looks like a miraculous recovery. They work very hard at their rehabilitation. They do well with their prosthetic devices, and they can be fairly independent when they get home. And many will go out and get jobs and lead fairly normal lives. But others will remain in the care of family members or needing the assistance of family members for a long, long time, if not forever. So, and that, of course, I think a lot of people don't realize how that impacts whole communities. One of the disabled vets I talk about, and they were soldiers who wound up in the care of his mom for years. He's still pretty much in the care of his mom. 10 years on now, 12 years on now. His mother had been the head counselor for at-risk youth in the high school system of a major city. She had been in charge of helping. She was a psychologist, and she was in charge of supervising the care of all these kids who have problems and who needed her every bit as much in their way as her son did. And they searched a long time before they could find anyone as qualified to replace her in the community. So there's that kind of ripple effect with all these moms and dads and wives who have to, or husbands in some cases, who have to stay at home and take care of the recuperating vet. They then are a loss to the community things that they've been involved in. So the notion is that civilians are pretty much untouched by these wars. But it's not true in any community where veterans are coming home in and requiring this additional assistance.
Well, and returning to the health issues faced by veterans, in addition to complications resulting from physical injuries, we also often see mental health and emotional problems, PTSD, depression, the very alarming suicide rate among veterans. What are some of the biggest mental health and emotional issues that we see among veterans when they return home? And are there any statistics that really prove and demonstrate just how horrible and how big of a problem this is?
Well, there are some. It's hard to know. You know, a lot of that is again kept behind closed doors. There's a great deal. We know that there's great increases in domestic violence in the home, in child abuse, in the murder of wives and girlfriends and children. When some vets come home and have been damaged and take it out in violent ways, we know that the suicide rate for these soldiers of the recent wars is as high as it has ever been. But we tend to talk about PTSD and think that all of this results from war. And in previous wars, that might be true. And I know just by being in war zones, I tested off the charts for PTSD myself, and I didn't even meet the official criteria, but I sure scored up there on the charts. But in this war, I think what's much less known about is that the opioid epidemic that the whole country is currently facing got its biggest launching pad in the VA hospitals because the big pharmaceutical companies, particularly one called Purdue Pharmacy, which makes OxyContin, put so much pressure on the VA. They got Congress on their side. They set up all these phony pain foundations and staffed them with their own experts who testified to the Congress and to the public that soldiers needed these painkillers. And so it became part of the protocol in the VA under all this pressure from the pain foundations and the Congress and from veterans organizations who thought that painkillers sounded like a great idea, since most of our returning vets are in some kind of pain or another. But what the manufacturers didn't tell anybody was how addictive these things are. And pretty soon the VA was handing them out to people who came in not with physical pain, but with PTSD. So soldiers who tested with PTSD might, in some hospitals, be given these addictive opioids. And now we have no way of distinguishing how much of the after effects of this on our veterans are the effects of war itself, or are the effects of becoming addicted to these terrible drugs. It's very difficult to tell the difference between an accidental overdose and a suicide when these drugs come into play, so that also complicates the statistics. But in any case, the things that soldiers are subjected to in war, and the things, what I found in talking to veterans, was not so much things that had been done to them, but things that they had done to others. What many are identifying now as moral injury. Soldiers who do under orders in the field something that they would never have dreamed of doing, something that contradicts all the moral precepts that they have grown up with. And they just can't live with that, many of them, when they get home. There's a story in my book of one veteran who fell into that category. He'd been given an order which he obeyed, and caused him to think of himself as nothing but a murderer. And he took his own life. And he is representative of thousands of soldiers who have been in that position. And we don't know. I mean, some soldiers follow those orders and don't give it another thought, apparently. I talked to soldiers who regarded killing people as just their job, and even soldiers who said it was a big high to do that. But then there are others who cannot live with having taken those actions. So it's a whole range of very personal reactions to what soldiers have undergone and to what they have done of their under orders or of their own volition in the course of wars. But clearly, all of this, none of this would have happened if these wars hadn't happened. So we're looking at millions of guys and women whose lives are very badly damaged because of these wars. And of course, these are wars that never had to occur. These were wars that we just elected to do and thought would be oh so easy, you know. This is the problem with getting the wrong leadership in civilian leadership in control, and then getting a lot of mediocre generals who don't raise a stink about it and refuse to obey orders.
Sure, and we'll return to that subject, the subject of avoiding these unnecessary wars, in a moment when we conclude. But first, since we've been using this term PTSD, I assume that a lot of people in the audience have a general sense of what that term is, what that term means, but probably not everybody. So can you define what PTSD is?
Well, it has a very specific textbook definition, but the term has come to be used so loosely that a lot of people are said to be suffering from PTSD who don't fit that textbook definition. As I said, I'm one of those people. The textbook definition is that the person has been traumatized by an experience that has brought extreme terror or fear and a sense of helplessness, the sense of this imminent death and being helpless to do anything about it. That is what is psychiatrically is said to produce this traumatic effect. There are other things that happen that get mixed up with PTSD. For example, you get so on edge in a combat zone, as everybody knows, that you get a very intensified startle reflex. You become hypervigilant. And a lot of people who present with hypervigilance are diagnosed with PTSD, whether they've had that experience of facing imminent death and feeling helpless to do anything about it or not. So it just becomes, PTSD then becomes a catch-all term for anybody who is having these very natural reactions. When you come back to a peacetime situation, you still react in the way you would react in war. You hear a loud noise, you jump. You sense a threat, you dive under the table. And it takes a while for that to wear off. That would wear off naturally. But too often those people get diagnosed with something like PTSD and given super potent drugs to get through it, which they don't really need. So this is I don't quite know what to do with all of those people who think they're suffering from PTSD, and now many loved ones are being treated for PTSD because they say they were traumatized by worrying about their absent soldier in the field. They have very legitimate worries, and I'm sure it was a hard time for them. But that is really stretching the definition of PTSD out of all semblance to what it really is supposed to be. So this is a very, very confused issue, and I think the general public doesn't understand it very well. I think many professionals don't understand it very well. I think people who haven't been in war zones don't understand it very well because it's a surprise to see how jumpy you can get out there and how that stays with you when you come home. You have to go through it to see what it is and to understand that a lot of it is just natural and wears off. But the other parts of it, that real trauma from the sense of helplessness, is what gets people, and as I mentioned before, the moral injury. In a way, this is complicated by the fact that the Pentagon tends to reject the textbook definition because they say things like Marines are never helpless. That may be the official word, but I've met a lot of Marines who felt pretty helpless at when they thought they were going to die in the next few moments. So again, even within the military itself, there is this confusion and resistance to the real definition.
So one last question for you before we wrap up. What are some of the solutions? What can people do as individuals, and what can we all do as a society to really stop this from happening?
Well, I think that the first thing is to make peace abroad and peace here. That's a big part of it. You can politically take a stand against wars, even if it's not your kids who pay the price of them. But I think it's important to, I meet a lot of civilians here who go up to soldiers a few years ago anyway, when soldiers were still walking around in uniform. They go up to them in the coffee shop and say, "Thank you for your service." That's not the point. More to the point is to find out from veterans organizations in your own community if there is something that you can do to help. Maybe there's a family that needs a babysitter, or whatever the families need. That's a way to help. But and then also keep in mind that a lot of soldiers do fare pretty well and do come through just fine. So don't regard all soldiers as having been terribly victimized by these wars. And even those who have been victimized are generally, fairly proud of their service, though a great many of them now realize that these wars were pointless and they did their service for no good reason. So I would say, see what help you can give to veterans organizations themselves, or to families in your community, or maybe your faith group or some civic group that you belong to is doing things to assist returning vets. Do what you can, and most of all, just be aware that all these veterans are doing the best they can to reintegrate in their communities and go on with life as best they can. And most of them will do that, but a little help would not be amiss.
Sure, and thank you for joining us today to shed some light on these important and often overlooked issues, and also for helping us to discuss the importance that peace plays in all of these issues as well. If someone is interested in learning more about your work or learning more about the sorts of issues and topics we've been discussing today, what readings and resources do you recommend they check out?
Well, I've listed my articles on my website, so there are links to all of them if anyone wants to read more articles. And I would especially recommend one that I have coming out in a few days at Tom Dispatch, because this is about the efforts to privatize the VA and the current legislation that's before Congress. If in this election the Republicans gain control of Congress again, this legislation will be passed, and this major blow will be inflicted on the VA. I think any veterans listening to my voice might want to go and read the details of how that has come about, before they go to vote in November.
All right. Well, thank you very much once again for joining us. And I want to encourage everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/veterans-issues. And of course, we'll link to AnnJonesOnline.com along with the 3 books that we touched on at various times during this interview. They Were Soldiers, War Is Not Over When It's Over, and Kabul in Winter. And also, once that Tom Dispatch article becomes available, there will be a link to that article as well. So the show notes page again is wakeupcallpodcast.com/veterans-issues. And I would like to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list and to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcatcher so that you can make sure to never miss an episode and stay up to date on what's going on with the show. And Anne, I know I said this a few moments ago, but these really are important issues, and they really are issues that are far too often overlooked. So thank you for joining us today to discuss them and shed some light on all of these issues.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.